Beale Street, Memphis, is a place of music, culture, and history. A vibrant street that has seen both joy and sorrow. But recently, it's become a scene of something darker. Bar owners, pillars of the community, are being found dead in brutal and inexplicable ways. The murders are precise, calculated, and chilling, with no clear connection between the victims, except for one haunting detail. Each of these bar owners has ties to a string of unsolved crimes from the 1980s, crimes that were buried beneath layers of silence and corruption. Detective Tasha Reed is familiar with the shadows that haunt Memphis, having grown up in South Memphis, where the city's past is never far from the surface. When a new body is discovered, she's thrust into a case that feels eerily familiar. What begins as another routine investigation soon pulls Tasha into a web of secrets far more dangerous than she ever anticipated. The deeper she digs, the more she uncovers a link to an old cover-up, a cover-up that may involve her own father. As Tasha uncovers the dark truths hidden in Memphis's past, she begins to question everything she thought she knew about justice, family, and the cost of uncovering painful truths. The search for a killer becomes a race against time, as Tasha realizes that the murders are part of a greater revenge, a vengeance for victims forgotten by history. Beale Street, a historic landmark in Memphis, Tennessee, is known for its rich musical heritage and vibrant nightlife. For decades, it has been home to jazz, blues, and soul, a cultural epicenter that draws both locals and tourists. But beyond the music, Beale Street holds a darker, more complex history. The bar owners who've made this street their livelihood are, for the most part, long-standing members of the community, known for their contributions to both business and culture. Yet in recent years, their lives have been marred by an alarming series of murders. The first death was a shock. A local bar owner found lifeless in his establishment, a man who had been seen the night before laughing with patrons, seemingly untouched by anything sinister. But as the murders continued, the pattern became clear. These victims were not just random targets. Each was tied to a string of unsolved crimes that date back to the 1980s, murders and disappearances linked to the city's underbelly. The police had swept these cases under the rug, offering no justice, no closure, and leaving the community to wonder what really happened all those years ago. For Detective Tasha Reed, the investigation is personal. Born and raised in South Memphis, she has seen firsthand the scars of injustice, both in the streets and within her own family. Her late father, a former police officer, had connections to the original cover-up, a truth Tasha never fully understood until now. As the murders continue, Tasha finds herself drawn deeper into a mystery that ties her family, her city, and the victims together in ways she could never have imagined. The deeper she goes, the more it becomes clear that these killings are not just the work of a lone killer. They are the acts of someone seeking retribution for long-forgotten crimes. The killer's motive, now tied to vengeance, forces Tasha to confront uncomfortable truths, not only about the justice system, but also about her own bloodline. Before we continue with this investigation, make sure to subscribe to Beyond the Evidence for more in-depth investigations into real cases and untold stories. Detective Tasha Reed's connection to Memphis runs deep. Born and raised in South Memphis, she is no stranger to the complexities and struggles that define the city. Raised by her mother after her father's untimely death, Tasha learned early on that life in this part of Memphis wasn't easy. Her father, a former police officer, was both a figure of authority and a deeply troubled man, haunted by secrets he carried to his grave. These secrets were something Tasha never fully understood. Growing up, her mother, a steadfast woman who worked tirelessly to keep the family afloat, rarely spoke of him. Yet there were whispers in the neighborhood, whispers about Tasha's father's involvement in cases that were never solved, and his connection to Memphis's most dangerous circles. For years, Tasha tried to compartmentalize her personal life from her professional one. She joined the police force not just out of a sense of duty, but to escape the shadows of her family's past. But as the murders along Beale Street grew more frequent and the connections to her father's generation became undeniable, the lines between the two blurred in ways Tasha could no longer ignore. Each case she investigated, each bar owner's death, brought her closer to confronting the reality of her father's involvement in something much darker than she could have imagined. Her relationship with her colleagues was equally complex. There was Deputy Lucas Grant, a fellow officer who had known her father. Their professional relationship was marked by mutual respect, but Lucas's growing unease about Tasha's deepening involvement in the case began to strain their dynamic. He warned her repeatedly that digging into the past would not only risk her career, but also her safety. Yet Tasha couldn't walk away. The weight of the unsolved murders pressed down on her, but more than that, it was the personal betrayal that tugged at her. The possibility that her father, a man she had idolized, might have been involved in the cover-up of these very crimes felt like a betrayal in itself. How could someone she had loved and trusted be capable of hiding the truth for so long? Tasha also had to reckon with her family's complicated legacy. Her mother, still living in the same modest home in South Memphis, had a different view of the past. She rarely discussed Tasha's father's work as a police officer, perhaps hoping to shield her daughter from the painful truths. But Tasha, driven by a sense of justice and an urgent need for answers, couldn't avoid these revelations any longer. The further she dug, the clearer it became that the truth about her father's actions in the 1980s was somehow connected to the current killings, and perhaps even the killer's motives. Then there was the Beale Street community, with its own web of relationships. Bar owners, musicians, and local business owners all seemed to have some degree of involvement in the events of the past. Some were eager to help Tasha with her investigation, believing that justice had been denied for too long. Others, however, were hesitant, wary of stirring up old wounds. The tension was palpable, especially as Tasha's investigation began to expose the painful rift between the people who had once protected each other and those who had benefited from silence. In this environment, Tasha found herself torn between two conflicting worlds: the duty to uncover the truth and the loyalty to her family and her city. The pressure of the investigation, combined with the personal stakes, forced her to confront emotions she had long buried. The ghosts of her past, of her father, of her family haunted her every decision. And yet, the closer she got to the truth, the more determined she became to see it through. For Tasha, the investigation was no longer just about solving the murders. It was about coming to terms with her family's legacy and finding a way to heal the wounds that had festered for far too long. The phone call came late one evening, just after Tasha had finished reviewing the latest victim's case file. She had grown used to the routine: crime scene photographs, witness statements, and the slow unraveling of a story that never seemed to make sense. But this call was different. An anonymous tip, delivered in a low, crackling voice, pointed her to a new lead that tied the recent murders back to the cold cases of the 1980s. Tasha's pulse quickened. There was no turning back now. The connection was buried deep in the city's past. So deep, in fact, that Tasha had never known to look there. The victims, bar owners all, were connected by more than just their businesses along Beale Street. Each had been linked in some way to a series of unsolved crimes from the 1980s. Disappearances, drug deals gone wrong, and violent confrontations that had been swept under the rug. At first glance, they seemed like random incidents, unconnected and long forgotten. But the anonymous caller's cryptic words suggested something more. Tasha began to sift through old police records, piecing together details she had never been taught in the academy. She uncovered a pattern buried in the archives that suggested these crimes were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger web of corruption and betrayal. The more she dug, the clearer it became. These bar owners weren't merely victims of a random killer. They were targets, perhaps the last witnesses to a larger crime that had been erased from history. And the person responsible for these murders might be someone seeking justice for the wrongs that had been silenced long ago. The early warning signs were undeniable. As Tasha delved deeper, she discovered that many of the victims had been part of a community that was once tightly bound by shared secrets. They were more than just business owners. They were witnesses, sometimes accomplices, to the criminal activity that had taken place in Memphis during the 1980s. Some of them had tried to speak out, to expose what had happened, but their voices had been silenced in one way or another. Some had fled the city. Others had simply disappeared. As the investigation continued, the warning signs grew clearer. The killer wasn't just targeting random victims. Each murder seemed to send a message, one that Tasha was only beginning to understand. The pattern of the killings wasn't a random act of violence. It was calculated, deliberate, and tied to a quest for retribution. The victims weren't chosen by chance. They were chosen because they had been part of a cover-up that had erased the truth, leaving the killer with no choice but to seek vengeance. Tasha's involvement in the case took on new urgency. With each new clue, the weight of the investigation pressed down on her, and she began to question the cost of uncovering these long-buried truths. The further she went, the more personal the case became. She had always known there were things about her father's past that didn't add up, but now, with the murders tied to the city's darkest secrets, Tasha couldn't help but wonder if her father's legacy was part of the reason these victims had never received justice. Was her father involved in the cover-up? And if so, How far had the corruption within the Memphis police force really gone? With every piece of the puzzle she uncovered, Tasha realized the stakes had grown higher. The city's history was not just buried, it had been actively erased, and the killer was the one determined to restore what had been lost. The case was no longer just about solving a string of murders. It had become a search for the truth, no matter the cost. The investigation was no longer just an inquiry into a series of murders. It had become a hunt for a killer whose motives stretched far beyond the present day. As Tasha continued to sift through old case files, she uncovered more unsettling truths. Each victim, each bar owner, had been connected to a larger network of people, a community bound by silence and shared history. The closer she got to understanding the full scope of the crimes, the more the killer's motives began to emerge from the shadows. What had seemed like a string of unrelated murders now appeared to be a calculated campaign of vengeance, orchestrated by someone seeking to right the wrongs of the past. It wasn't long before Tasha's own investigation began to attract attention. The deeper she dug, the more she uncovered about the network of individuals involved in the 1980s cover-up. The connections were vast: police officers, politicians, business owners, all implicated in a web of corruption that had allowed these crimes to remain unsolved for decades. The more Tasha uncovered, the more dangerous the investigation became. Her every move seemed to be watched, as if someone knew exactly how close she was to exposing the truth. The first major escalation came when Tasha's office was broken into. It wasn't just a random burglary. Whoever had done it had been searching for something specific. They left nothing behind but a single photograph, a faded image from the 1980s of a group of bar owners standing together, their faces frozen in time. It was a reminder that the people Tasha was investigating weren't just victims. They were participants in something far more dangerous. The photograph had been taken before the murders began, but it symbolized everything the killer sought to destroy: the connections between the victims, the secrets they held, and the truth that had been buried for years. As the investigation grew more intense, Tasha's sense of isolation deepened. Deputy Lucas Grant, once a trusted colleague, became increasingly concerned about the direction of the case. He cautioned her to step back, warning her that her involvement in the investigation was putting her career and her life at risk. But Tasha could not turn back. The more she uncovered, the more personal the case became. The shadows of her father's past loomed larger, and she found herself questioning his role in the original cover-up. What had he known, and what had he hidden? Was he complicit in the crimes, or had he been a victim of a system that had betrayed him just as it had betrayed so many others? Then the second escalation hit. One evening, as Tasha walked through Beale Street, she saw something that would forever change the course of her investigation. In the dim light of a street lamp, she spotted a familiar face among the crowd, one she hadn't expected to see again. It was a former police officer, a man whose name had appeared repeatedly in her research. His presence was no coincidence. He had been one of the officers involved in the original investigation back in the 1980s, and now he was on the street where the murders were taking place. Tasha's heart raced. This man knew something, something that could tie everything together. But before she could approach him, he disappeared into the crowd, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. This encounter marked a turning point in the case. The killer was no longer the only threat Tasha faced. As she closed in on the truth, it became clear that the people who had been complicit in the original cover-up were just as dangerous. Someone didn't want these secrets exposed, and they were willing to do whatever it took to keep the past buried. The murders continued. Each new death seemed to be a twisted echo of the past, a reminder that the city's darkest secrets were far from forgotten. The killer's method was becoming clearer with each crime. Each victim had a direct link to the 1980s, and each death was a direct act of retribution. But there was one thing that didn't fit. The killer wasn't just avenging the victims of the past. They were trying to send a message. The question was, who were they trying to warn, and why? As Tasha raced to connect the dots, she felt the walls closing in around her. With every step she took, the danger grew, and the lines between justice and revenge began to blur. The deeper she dug, the closer she came to the truth, and the closer she got to the killer. Time was running out, and Tasha knew that whoever was behind these murders was not finished. They would stop at nothing to ensure that the past remained buried. Tasha's investigation had reached a point of no return. Each new lead, each discovery, brought her closer to the truth, but it also felt like the walls were closing in faster. As she pored over the evidence, patterns began to emerge. Lines that had once seemed disconnected now weaving together in a chilling tapestry of betrayal. The murders were not random. They were deliberate, and they were part of something much larger than Tasha could have imagined. The killer wasn't just avenging the victims of the past. They were trying to expose a truth that had been buried for decades. Her search led her to one startling revelation after another, each more damning than the last. The photograph that had been left behind in her office after the break-in was more than just a reminder of the 1980s. Its presence had been a warning. Tasha now understood that the people in that photo weren't just victims. They were complicit in the very crimes the killer sought to avenge. As she cross-referenced names, dates, and locations, the connections grew clearer. The bar owners who had been murdered were all tied to a series of cover-ups and corrupt dealings in the 1980s, and each of them had been involved in some way in a conspiracy that had shielded the truth from public. But it was when she uncovered a file buried deep within the Memphis Police Department archives that the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. It was a report from her father's time on the force, a report that had been marked confidential and locked away for decades. The document contained details of a covert investigation into organized crime and corruption, implicating several high-ranking officers, city officials, and even some of the bar owners now dead at the hands of the killer. Tasha's father had been part of the investigation, but the file showed that he had also been tasked with covering up key details, ensuring that the city's powerful elite remained protected. Tasha's heart raced as she processed the information. Her father hadn't just been a bystander. He had been part of the machine that had perpetuated the cycle of corruption. But the most devastating revelation came when she connected the killer's pattern with her father's involvement. The killer wasn't just targeting random victims. They were targeting the people who had been involved in the cover-up, those who had turned a blind eye to the truth. And the person behind the murders, the one seeking revenge, was someone who had once been a part of that very world, someone who had been silenced, forgotten, and left behind. With this new knowledge, Tasha's perspective shifted. The killer wasn't an outsider. They were a product of the very system she had sworn to uphold. They were someone who had been betrayed, just as the victims had been betrayed, and now they were taking matters into their own hands. The killer's motive was no longer a mystery. It was about justice, about making the people responsible for the cover-ups face the consequences of their actions. But in the killer's eyes, justice didn't come in the form of a courtroom. It came in the form of retribution. Tasha felt a surge of conflicting emotions. She understood the killer's pain, their need for vengeance, but she also knew that justice couldn't be served through murder. The revelations had torn apart everything Tasha had believed in. Her father's legacy, once one of authority and respect, was now marred by his involvement in the very corruption that had plagued Memphis for decades. But the truth had to be known, no matter how painful it was. Determined to confront the killer and bring them to justice, Tasha began to piece together the final threads of the investigation. She knew the danger she was in, but she also knew that the killer wouldn't stop until the last secret had been exposed. The closer she got, the more Tasha realized that this wasn't just an investigation. It was a race against time to stop a vengeful force from turning the truth into something far darker. Tasha's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, emotions, and revelations. As the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, she understood that the killer's next move was imminent. She wasn't just chasing down a murderer. She was chasing down a person who had become a symbol of the city's darkest secrets, someone who had made it their mission to tear down the walls of corruption that had stood for too long. The final confrontation was approaching, and Tasha knew that she had to face it head-on. But as the investigation neared its climax, she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth might be too much for anyone to bear. The truth, once uncovered, brought more than just clarity. It brought a devastating cost. Tasha stood at the precipice of the investigation's end, but she knew there would be no simple resolution. The consequences of what she had uncovered were too great to ignore, and the weight of the secrets she had unearthed pressed down on her like a physical burden. The killer's motives, rooted in years of betrayal and injustice, had exposed the festering wounds of Memphis's past. But in bringing those wounds to light, Tasha had risked not only her career, but also the fragile ties she had left to her family, her colleagues, and her own sense of identity. The final revelation, her father's role in the cover-up, was a blow from which she knew she might never fully recover. The man she had idolized, the figure who had shaped so much of her life, had been part of the very system she had dedicated herself to dismantling. The emotional toll was immeasurable. Tasha grappled with a deep sense of betrayal, not just by her father, but by the city itself. The justice she had sought for the victims had become entangled with her own need to reconcile her family's legacy. The truth had come at the price of her peace, and now she was left to pick up the pieces of her fractured past. Her colleagues, too, reacted to the aftermath with a mix of skepticism and reluctance. Some saw her actions as courageous. She had exposed the rot that ran deep in the city's institutions. Others, however, viewed her as a threat to the status quo. Tasha found herself isolated, caught between those who praised her for uncovering the truth and those who believed she had gone too far. Her future with the department hung in the balance, and she couldn't help but wonder if the cost of justice had been worth the personal sacrifices. In the quiet moments after the investigation concluded, Tasha reflected on what she had learned. The truth was messy, painful, and often unjust. In her pursuit of justice, she had exposed layers of corruption that no one, least of all herself, was prepared to confront. But the killer's vengeance had, in the end, given her the clarity she needed to see that justice was more than just punishment. It was about understanding the full scope of the wrongs committed and working to ensure they never happened again. Now, as Tasha faced the consequences of her actions, she knew one thing for certain. The pursuit of truth was not without sacrifice, but it was the only path forward. And though the scars of this investigation would never fade, Tasha was determined to carry its lessons with her as she moved forward.